So like Hempel from our last module, Ryle suggests that the true meaning of mental terms consists in behavioral dispositions. In The Concept of Mind, he tells readers that, quoting, "I try to show that when we describe people as exercising qualities of mind, we are not referring to occult episodes of which their overt acts and utterances are effects. We are referring to those overt acts and utterances themselves." Unlike Campbell, however, Ryle does not rely upon empirical theory. Rather, Ryle's project is to recover the knowledge regarding the nature and working of the mind inherent in our pre-theoretic, ordinary conception of the mind as ensconced in our language. Again, he describes himself as a conceptual or linguistic cartographer. He tells us that this book offers what may, with some reservations, be described as a theory of mind, but it does not give any new information about minds. We possess already a wealth of information about minds, information which is neither derived from nor upset by the arguments of philosophers. The philosophical arguments which constitute this book are intended not to increase what we know about minds, but to rectify the logical geography of the knowledge we already possess. A famous or infamous illustration of Ryle's argument style and methodological approach in the book comes from his diagnosis that Cartesian dualism is in fact simply the result of a category mistake. He suggests that we observe the operations of the mind and then incorrectly make an inference that those operations must have a corresponding thing that is doing the operating. And he draws an analogy as follows. He says, suppose, and this is hard to imagine now, but he says, suppose that your parents come to visit you at Cal State Long Beach, and you take them out to the quad and you show them around and you walk through the library and you go to the lecture halls and you introduce them to your professors and so on, and your parents say, "Oh, this is wonderful," all except for that Wallace guy, he's crazy. But all of these things are very fantastic. The quad, the library, the lecture halls, the professors, it's all wonderful. But when are you going to show us the university? You know, the thing. The university. And this is what Ryle thinks we do when we ontologize an object to put all the operations of the mind into. We make this category mistake. Thus, though they come at it from quite different philosophical perspectives, employing quite different methodologies, both Hempel and Ryle make the same basic claim, that the meanings of ordinary mental terms are exhausted by the overt behaviors that we would use to identify, operationalize, or correctly describe or attribute those mental terms. Unfortunately for methodological behaviorism, there were a number of incredibly insightful criticisms offered up. I'll mention two figures who offer up what I think are decisive refutations of this view. On the one hand, there's Roderick Chisholm, and on the other hand, there's Hilary Putnam. And together they offer up three devastating criticisms of philosophical behaviorism, what I refer to as the three horsemen of philosophical behaviorism. Now, Chisholm here thinks that the most salient difficulty for philosophical behaviorism is that mental terms do not operate for the most part in isolation from one another. Rather, the connections between the typical behavioral causes and the typical behavioral effects, even for those mental terms that appear to have more or less criterial overt behavioral causes and effects, are mediated by the interaction of mental states with other mental states. And in his classic paper, then, he adopts a descriptivist theory of reference for mental state terms, and he argues that attempts to define mental state terms like belief exclusively through their typical overt physical causes and effects fails precisely because such states have no typical causes and effects absent their relationships to other mental state terms. Thus, he claims you cannot define a mental state term in isolation. Mental state terms constitute a closed, holistic lexicon, or a conceptual scheme. Now, what exactly does that amount to? Well, for Chisholm, what this means is that I can't define what it is to believe that Buckingham Palace is filled with pickles, because that belief, even if it has a cause and effect, may not necessarily manifest any particular cause and effect associations absent other mental states. So suppose I believe the Buckingham Palace is filled with pickles. Suppose that I abhor pickles. Well, then I'll stay away from Buckingham Palace. Suppose that I'm hungry and love pickles. I'll try to get in. Suppose that I'm a reporter. I'll ask the royal press representatives about their pickle problem, and so on. So that the manifestation of the effects of a belief or the causes that bring about a belief are going to be dependent upon the other beliefs I have, the other desires I have, and so on. So that you cannot define what it is to believe something in isolation, what it is to feel some pain in isolation. So if I smash my finger with a hammer and I'm by myself, I may go on an expletive tirade. But if I'm in the presence of a 3-year-old child, I may go on an expletive tirade. No, I won't do that. I may not. If I'm trying to be the stereotypical tough guy, I may try to suppress all behavioral responses to the pain at all. Well, Chisholm grounds his objections in a descriptivist account of reference. Putnam adopts a direct reference approach. In Brains and Behavior, he denies the viability of attempts to identify mental states and properties with the effects of those mental states and properties. According to Putnam, the reference of mental state terms such as belief or pain consists of the mental state itself, regardless of its typical causes and effects. In other words, some mental state terms seem to get their meaning, at least in large part, from their intrinsic qualitative nature. Putnam looks at conscious mental states, especially qualitative conscious experiences like pain, and he asserts that the conscious phenomenal experience provides a direct referential link to the state. Pains on this line are painful, and this feature alone defines these states. And so Putnam in this paper presents a series of counterfactual thought experiments in which he suggests that one can intuitively judge that mental states count as pains despite being dissociated from their typical causes and their typical effects, or both. Finally, Putnam observes that many mental properties such as, and I'm dyslexic so I'll mispronounce this I'm sure, iophobia, a fear of palindromes, or ankylophobia, a fear of stiff or immobile joints, and malaise, a feeling of discomfort one can't precisely identify, but which is often described as a sense that things are just not right. All of these states seem to lack any definitive set of behavioral effects, but these terms don't seem to be meaningless or less meaningful than other mental state terms. Yet they don't exhibit a small group of overt behaviors that one might consider criterial of having that state. Thus our 3 horsemen. Mental states are difficult to define, describe, or ascribe in isolation from one another, given that they're at least to some degree holistic and interactive in the way that we conceive of them. Horseman 2. Mental states seem to be understood in a direct reference fashion in the sense that they are oftentimes definitively associated with a set of phenomenal qualities that pick them out regardless of their causes or effects. And Horseman 3. Some mental states seem to not have any typical overt causes or effects that we might use as criterial ways of ascribing those states to individuals, and yet those mental state terms do not seem to be any the less meaningful or applicable because of that.